Welcome. Thank you for joining us on a Friday at 1:30. I really appreciate that you took the time to decide to discover a little bit about not only my work, but also the work of Grégory Pierrot and Anny-Dominique Curtius that I've invited for this little causerie or book salon to discuss my research, but also French Caribbean literature per se. So before I introduce my panelists, I would like first to acknowledge the people who helped me put this webinar together. We have a fabulous team in the Dean's office. They're always there whenever I've got an idea to support me and to work on the communication and everything dealing with PR. So first of all, I would like to thank Dean Kathleen Canning for her support. John Waterhouse, and today we have also Ellen Palenska, who helped me making this beautiful poster, and Tara Ousley, who was here also to help with the organization. I know I'm forgetting some people. I appreciate also the support of Brian Riddle from Swigs, who did some advertisement for this get-together today, and also the Center for African and African American Studies. So now I would like to introduce first Dr. Curtius. She's an associate professor of Francophone Studies in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Iowa. Her research lies at the crossroads of Francophone studies, post-colonial ecologies, and comparative Caribbean critical theory. She also explored traumatic memory of slavery in visual and performing arts. In addition to numerous articles, she's the author of Suzanne Césaire, Archéologie littéraire et artistique d'une mémoire empêchée, published in 2020 by Cartala. And I will do, I'm announcing it already, I will do another book salon introducing her work in April 16th of this year. At the end of this book salon, I will post in the chat a lot of information about upcoming events. I will also put more information about Anny Curtius in the chat whenever we'll be starting talking about some points. So my second panelist is Grégory Pierrot. He's an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Connecticut at Stamford. He earned a PhD in English at the Pennsylvania State University. He studies the cultural production of the Atlantic African diaspora, focusing more specifically on conversation, exchanges, and antagonism between Haiti, France, the United States, and the United Kingdom. He is the author of The Black Avenger in the Black Atlantic. His work has appeared in many publications and journals like Atlantic Studies, Studies in American Fiction. And soon, I will also put in the chat a lot of information about his work and also Annie's work. Before I forget, again, at the bottom of the screen, you will see the Q&A button. So whenever you have questions, do not hesitate to contact, send a little something in the Q&A, and then we'll be able to answer your questions. So right now, I would like to give the stage of a Zoom space to Anny Curtius. And while she will be doing some introductions, I will be typing some information for you in the chat. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm really happy to share this virtual space with you all.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline, for the invitation, and thank you to all of you that I cannot see. I just want to thank you for taking the time to listening to be a participant in our conversation on this very important work that Jacqueline Couti published in 2016, namely Dangerous Creole Liaisons, let me give you the second part of the title, Sexuality and Nationalism in French Caribbean Discourses from 1806 to 1897. So first of all, before I kind of jump into the analysis of the work and its importance for Francophone Caribbean literature, I just want to say a few words about Jacqueline's publication. So Jacqueline is Laurence H. Favrot, Associate Professor of French Studies in the Department of Modern and Classical Literatures and Cultures at Rice University. She's the author of Dangerous Creole Liaison, which I just mentioned, that came out in 2016. A forthcoming book, also to be published by Liverpool UP, is entitled Sex, Sea and Self, Sexuality and Nationalism in French Caribbean Discourses, 1924-1948. Jacqueline is also the author of two annotated editions of novels by Auguste Traversé de Sansac and Génie Manet. Both of those critical editions came out in the collection Autrement Même with L'Harmattan. Finally, Jacqueline is also the co-editor of a special issue of on Afrofeminism, Black feminism, for the Australian journal Essays in French Literature and Culture. And this special issue came out in 2019, I think, Jacqueline, correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so neglected corpus, lack of literary brilliance, the propensity to study texts by male authors from the French Antilles, and the lack of cross-pollination between 20th century and 19th century literary periods, the Caribbean literary canon are some of the keywords that I would like to bring to your attention to discuss the importance of Jacqueline's book, Dangerous Creole Liaisons. I want to make the argument that Dangerous Creole Liaison is an indispensable reference, not only for scholars and students who are keen on studying what exists beyond mainstream Francophone Caribbean literature. The book is an essential read for everyone working on Francophone studies and more specifically Francophone Caribbean literature, because Jacqueline's analysis helps us to not only understand, but also revisit the underpinnings of Caribbean critical theory and literary aesthetics. So personally, I'm very happy to participate in this book discussion because my intellectual stance coincides with Jacqueline's, since, as I have shown in my recently published book on Suzanne Césaire, as well as in my first book, Symbiose d'une mémoire, Manifestations religieuses et littérature de la Caraïbe, we urgently need to explore texts produced in the early 20th century and the early modern period. So, for example, in my first book, I argued that we should further explore texts written by French missionaries from the 17th century through the 19th century. These texts, they're overlooked, as we know. Yet, they carefully, and I'm going to use some sort of a metaphor here, they carefully listen to the pulse of the plantation. And they are also able to tell us a lot about the habitus of violence on the plantation, gender and race relations. And they're important to further explore expressions of entangled identities and agency in contemporary Caribbean societies. So when I consider Jacqueline's book and her scholarship overall at a macro level, I want to argue that by carefully navigating an overlooked 19th century modern literature and an historical period that goes from 1806 to 1897, her book invites us to rethink the definition of the French Caribbean literary canon and she also asks us to ultimately um, produce a rupture in this canon. So this canon, composed of texts that emerged after the late 1930s, was, if you think about it, it was logically carved out through a transgressive aesthetics and constructed on the promise and a program of demarginalization of cultures and communities born out of the violence of colonization. Um, of course, when I say that, I'm thinking primarily about authors such as Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Édouard Glissant, or Patrick Chamoiseau, or Daniel Maximin. So the existence of a single authoritative body of works addressing the complexity of race, gender, creolization, sexuality, exoticism is in a sense to me a contradiction. It is a contradiction because if the primary notion that sustained this French Caribbean literary canon is transgression and demarginalization, therefore there cannot exist a single authoritative accepted monolithic discourse on race, politics, and identity. So that's my argument. There is a contradiction here. So the good challenge for Jacqueline is that she examined neglected literary texts produced by Martinican white Creole writers and non-Creole French travelers. So on one hand, this corpus is labeled as, let's say, sub-literature. And on the other hand, the Martinican white Creole authors, they're primarily, and this is important, they're primarily the descendants of early European slave owners, and they composed the white plantocracy in 19th century Martinique before and after the abolition of slavery. So when Jacqueline writes in her book that she did not focus on an overlooked literary corpus to promote a white Creole worldview, I believe that she specifically asks us to reconsider how to navigate between the complex categories of descendants and the complex categories of descendants of perpetrators and victims. And she also asks us to rethink if it is worth making a clear distinction between good literature, sub-literature, high literature, when it comes to reassess the keystones of French Caribbean literature, culture, and identity. So this is something that I want to kind of throw into the conversation. And when I say that, I think specifically about the serialized novel, such as Le Triomphe d'Églantine by white Creole René Bonneville, which is analyzed in, I think it's chapter 4 of the book. René Bonneville rejects pigmentocracy. He praised the woman of color in his text. And he also depicted the woman of color as a strong potomiton, as a strong agent of progress and modernity. And most importantly, he denounced the racial prejudices and the discrimination that defined the white plantocracy, and which Bonneville himself experienced, as Jacqueline explains. And I will return to this later. So by decentering the canon of French Caribbean literature, Jacqueline's Dangerous Liaisons and also the forthcoming book, Sex, Sea, and Self, propose compelling critical tools to examine corporeal experiences of agency, violence, silencing, socioeconomic oppression of women, as well as the intricacies of interracial relationships between slaves and slave owners. So by and large, Dangerous Liaison articulates new theoretical avenues on nationalism, race, female sexuality, agency, and colonial patriarchy as they relate to the 19th century. And the book also underscores how Caribbean thought does not start with Aimé Césaire's negritude, or French Fanon's analysis of desalienation and the creation of a new humanity. Jacqueline's focus on women experiences and on feminine authorship is purposeful as she seeks to rethink the parameters of mainstream Caribbean critique that, as we know, often overlooks theoretical contributions by Antillean women intellectuals in the domain of Caribbean critical theory. So now what I want to do is to quickly, because I'm kind of looking at the time, I want to explore some of the critical paradigms that are examined in the 4 chapters of the book. So from the very beginning, Jacqueline reconsiders discursive dichotomies. And I think that this is very important for us to kind of rethink, as I said, this entangled notion of the canon. So she reconsiders discursive dichotomies such as Black versus white Creole, mulattoes versus white Creole, mulatto versus Black, Francis versus Martinique, and post-slavery peasantry versus Creole plantocracy. So this is useful for her to craft the metaphor of dangerous liaison, okay, which is the title of the book, and to untangle, as she says, and here I quote, the intertwined dynamics of domination, resistance, and negotiation, and examine the use of female corporeality as a floating signifier for the nation, end of quote. Jacqueline argues that the sexualized representations of Black or white Creole women's bodies bring 2 compelling versions of nationalism into play. So on one hand, we have a constrained French nationalism that revolves around metropolitan France, and on the other hand, we have a transatlantic open-ended nationalism that incorporates the Antilles into a greater France. So this is really well, I think, carved out in the opening pages of the book. Then the book critically assesses the ways in which the symbolic representation of a sexual exoticism, essentialism, or objection of women in different statuses, so be they mulatresse, négresse, or capresse, servants and mistresses, devoted nursemaids, who are called da in the French Antilles, and virtuous white Creole women. This operates as a metaphor of the islands and the population. Another important element that I withdraw from the opening pages of the book is that Jacqueline labels her corpus, and I quote, a dominant fabric of cultural production fueled and restocked by a given social imaginary, end of quote. So a use of fabric is important as it shows that the pattern of production and reproduction of harmful values construct a system of violent hierarchies. So as far as the body of works analyzed in the book, so I just want to give you here the titles. So Prévost de Traversées, Les Amours de Sémédar et Carina, Julie Le Vieuse, Les Créoles ou la vie aux Antilles, published in 1835. So the Traversées novel was published in 1806. Louis Maynard de Quay, Outre-mer, published in 1835. Jenny Manet, Mayotte, 1896. Lafcadio's well-known Yuma, published in 1890, and 2 Years in the French West Indies, published in 1890 as well. And finally, René Bonneville, I just mentioned the book, Le Triomphe d'Églantine, published in 1897. So what I do here is I just give you a brief summary of each chapter, and then I conclude with for me, the major critical paradigms that are developed in the book. So chapter 1 is the chapter on Traversées, family romance, Les Amours de Sémédar et Carina. And in this novel, Jacqueline explains how Traversée articulates a rhetoric of purity. And it's and she explained that it's a mythical construction of the transatlantic Creole family, depicting Martinique as a laboratory of nationalism. Chapter 2 is devoted to Le Vieux, Les Créoles ou La vie aux Antilles, and Ménard de Quels, Outre-mer. And those texts construct a number of discourses which are really fascinating. So the first one, I mean, fascinating to study, of course. The first one, hybridity, is contamination for Le Vieux and Ménard. Second, abject Black motherhood is a threat against white masculine integrity. Three, the destruction of the Creole family is the devastation of the Creole idea of the nation. Four, the white oligarchy consider poison and slave rebellions as motifs of paranoia, terror, and malaise that transform the plantation into, according to Le Vieux and Ménard, into some sort of a Gothic place. In chapter 3, we have here an analysis of non-Creole observers. And so those non-Creoles are Lafcadio Hearn and Jenny Manet. And both of them, they rewrite a colonial literary heritage. They reinforce pigmentocracy, which Bonneville rejects. That's really interesting. While seemingly praising métissage. Okay, so we don't really know how to navigate between those texts, because on one hand, they reinforce meritocracy, but at the same time, métissage is a big discourse for them. And they also portray the women of color as a threat to white Creoles' intimacy. And that's the case in Manet's serialized novel, Mayotte. They also promote a colonial hierarchy of beauty, where the mulatto woman dominates. And this is, as many of you remember, this is really central in Lafcadio Hearn's work. The final chapter focuses on Bonneville, Le Triomphe d'Églantine. And I understood, and Jacqueline, correct me if I'm wrong, I understood that this is arguably, Le Triomphe d'Églantine is arguably an account of his own experiences of racism and discrimination within his own family, right? So indeed, in real life, Bonneville is the white Creole, is the Békir who betrayed his ethno class. He betrayed his class by fleeing to the neighboring island of St. Lucia to get married to a woman of color and she's from the popular urban class. And of course, it's a marriage that Bonneville's family evidently rejected. And Jacqueline argues that by rejecting pigmentocracy throughout his novel, Bonneville articulates an allegory of the mulatresse as a Creole Marianne, who, as Jacqueline says, who ultimately engenders the doudou, namely the sexualized embodiment and invention of colonialism. Jacqueline's contends that these 19th century texts are not simply an exotic, sentimental, and popular sub-literature, but rather a writing that has influenced well-known Martinican writers, such as Aimé Césaire or Patrick Chamoiseau, for example. And that this literature participates to the constructions of French colonial discourses on literary aesthetic. She also argues that contemporary scholarly debates on métissage and creolization needed to take these literary discourses into account, since the complex 19th century ideological tension between the rejection and praise of hybridity that is depicted in these novels they still shape contemporary sociocultural discourses on race in Martinique, and determines to a certain extent France's gaze on the French Antilles. So to conclude, Jacqueline also, in her book, invigorates and complexifies to me the critical parameters that sustain this kind of epistemological triangle, négritude, antillanité, créolité. And the book also underscores, for instance, that the writer Pierre-Régis de Sales and historian Denis de Marcillac, they were clearly aware of the urgency to recover and renew local history and knowledge that the dominant France threatens, ignores, or misrepresents. Thus, in a way, Jacqueline argues that de Sales and Denis de Marcillac foreshadowed much of the work that Edouard Glissant produced on what he called the non-history, and that is to say the collective and fragmented historical consciousness in the French Caribbean. So that's it for my intervention. So I think that I'll open the virtual floor to Greg. Or to Jacqueline, I don't know.
Well, thank you, Annie. Yes, thank you. I wanted to let the audience know that I put some information in the chat about Annie's work, so you could click on these links. I will also do the same about Dr. Pierrot's, Grégory's work in a minute or so when he's going to start doing his presentation. Annie, thank you so much. I was listening to you and I was like, oh my God, she's talking about someone nice. Oh, is it me? So thank you so much. And I'm sure now, I would like to remind people that you could click on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and ask questions. And after Annie's presentation, and I'm sure also Greg's presentation, I have no doubt we'll have a great, vigorous discussion at the end. So Greg, now the platform, the Zoom platform is yours.
Okay, all right, so let's see if I can do this. Okay, yes, you are that nice person, and I want to start there maybe with a little anecdote. Maybe it's typical of the COVID era, I guess, that we've met, but we've never really met. So we get to know each other at a distance. I just wanted to maybe give a few details as to how we first met. So I'd heard about Jacqueline's book, Dangerous Creole Liaison, or I'd seen it on the catalog and was really interested. And I was contacted by H France actually to write a review of it. So I thought, that's perfect. Then I also get a free copy of it, which is always nice. And so I wrote and published the review. And not too long after, I received an email from Dr. Couti, and maybe it says more about me than it does about anybody else. That at first I was really shocked, and my first reaction was to wonder if I said anything bad. And I thought, I didn't say anything bad. I really liked the book, and I don't know why that is, but it's really rare, in my experience, in any case, that you will write a book review and hear from the author. And so I eventually got over my own hangups and opened the email to find a very, very nice email, as it turns out, very kind. And also, and I think this is, in any case, it has defined my encounter and relation with Jacqueline, the beginning of a conversation, which again, to me was really a great surprise, because that's another thing about reviews. Of course, ideally, that's one of the purpose they should serve, introducing a book to other readers, but also maybe starting conversations. But they rarely turn into conversations, if we're going to be honest. But this one did, and that was again a really good surprise, and one maybe the first of many in this sense. This was a surprise, and maybe not so much of a surprise, in that in reading Jacqueline's book, I'd gotten a hunch that we might have a few things in common. And with time, I discovered that it was true, because my hunch is always true, as I also found out. But although some of the things we do have in common are maybe not as obvious as I thought at first. So for example, I discovered recently that we both grew up nerdy kids reading superhero comic books, which was a very nice surprise. As I don't usually share this information. We also have quite a few friends in common, which was also, a discovery, a gradual discovery. But we also have a background in common. We have roots in Martinique, arguably the most beautiful island in the world. I think that's an objective judgment here. A speck of ground in the Caribbean that's also supposed to be a piece of France. And so, to me, that's important for maybe obvious reasons, but also, we met in professional circumstances, but we have very similar study interests, and I think Martinican roots have a lot to do with that. They have a tendency to crisscross in really interesting ways. I often say, it's one of the ironies of Black life in the Black Atlantic that I've met almost more people of Martinican descent since I've moved to the US than I did when I lived in the eastern region of France, which is, arguably not a very Martinican place to be. But I don't think people meet by chance, and part of it is what we study, but I also think, part of where we come from in the same sense influences what we study and in turn, how we meet. I think this says something about maybe the difficulty that a Black scholar studying Caribbean literature and history can have working in France. And if anybody's been paying attention to recent conversations in France, you may know that these days being a Black French scholar working in the US is considered very suspect, notably by our government. And just for background, right? There's been declarations recently talking about how certain French academics working in post-colonial studies and other disciplines represent a sort of threat to national unity, right? Because their studies supposedly jeopardize what the French tend to call le roman national, or the national novel, which is the mythical progressive version of French history that is traditionally taught at school there. In that version of history, France tends to be the least racist country in the world, and it is also colorblind, right? Because that's the values of the Republic. In that history, also routinely the Caribbean and Caribbean people are known to exist, but one must avoid mentioning them, if only or unless you're talking about good things like sun, beaches, music, and maybe soccer. Depending on what you like. Such unpleasant things as how the Caribbean became French in the first place, or how they remain French, or what it means to be French in the Caribbean are better left undiscussed, usually. If you do have to mention the French Caribbean or French Caribbean literature in a French context, usually it's one name and one name only, Aimé Césaire, who is invoking him, arguably is a titan of literature. Everybody might agree with this, but is also often a way not to talk about him, his writings, or the context in which they were produced. Very often he serves as the gigantic tree hiding the forest of French Caribbean literature, past and present. But the thing is that forest is very old, and many horrible things have happened in it. Not just horrible things, but many of them. And it's much easier to pretend that we can't see it for this gigantic tree that Aimé Césaire is. This pattern is not limited to aficionados of the French national novel either. This happens also in some circles of people who study the Caribbean. Everybody likes a legend, a hero on a pedestal, or a gigantic tree. But if the legend is that France is a colorblind republic, you can imagine how dangerous it might be to consider what that legend looks like from a Caribbean vantage point. Or worse yet, imagine studying what this legend of national unity might owe the Caribbean. And what if, in order to ignore the Caribbean, France had needed the Caribbean in the first place? What if, in order to ignore the economic, cultural, political, and sexual legacy of slavery, France had needed people to write it into oblivion, so to speak? And so from here, I'm here to confirm two things. Jacqueline is a very nice person, as I've said it before. But if you're beholden to certain legends about France or French Caribbean literature, you may well find her work a little dangerous. As it happens, the book we'll be discussing today is entitled Dangerous Creole Liaisons. It's not by chance. I'll say maybe a bit more about that later. But to speak of the book, another thing I found that I think we have in common is our interest in literary and cultural genealogies and how they shape past and current understandings of national belonging. And the premise of the book is as seemingly simple as it is devastating. The overthrow of the Ancien Régime by the French Revolution led to a fundamental reconsideration of what it meant to be French. But France has traditionally thought of this upheaval exclusively within continental borders, avoiding at all costs discussions of the colonies in general, and maybe in particular such conflicts as the Haitian Revolution. Right? In 1791, the enslaved in what was then Saint-Domingue and later became Haiti, rose up in arms against the French and fought for a decade, beating the armies of 3 European countries. The conflict forced the French Republic to abolish slavery in 1794. It also demonstrated the power of enslavers and planters from the colonies, who throughout the time period influenced policies of the Republic and later the consulate. So everybody knows that Napoleon was married to Joséphine de Beauharnais, who was born and raised in Martinique. He was also wedded to the Planters Party, right? So much so that he decided to reestablish slavery in 1802 and send a huge expedition to Guadeloupe and Saint-Domingue to try and reestablish it. And he succeeded in Guadeloupe, but not in Saint-Domingue, where he was defeated and the colony declared independence as Haiti. Martinique was occupied by Great Britain during that time and never saw the abolition of 1794. But in 1804, Haiti becomes independent and sort of sets a standard and a very scary example for slave-holding countries throughout the Atlantic and for France in particular. And this is the point where Jacqueline's book begins, a point of intense reactionary politics in the wake of Haitian and French revolutions after Napoleon made himself emperor of all the French. Jacqueline's book reminds us that among those French people were the same slave-holding planter class who had influenced Napoleon in the first place. And that planter class, known as Béquet in Martinique, did plenty of lobbying in continental France, but they also planted their own trees, so to speak, by writing history and fiction and developing a history of a vision of France and Frenchness, inclusive of their interests and practices. So one of the central and striking images in Jacqueline's book, I would say, is that she presents all these texts, the corpus that she uses, as what she calls a fabrique of modernity. It is a cultural factory system, and I quote, as specializing in the production and reproduction of prejudicial values that in turn generate violent hierarchies. That system evolved along the years in response to key moments in French history. So the Haitian Revolution, Revolution of 1830, Revolution of 1848, and the Third Republic, churning out cultural products that were adapted to new circumstances, but similarly dedicated to offering justifications for Martinique's racist social order as an intrinsically French system. So the image, of course, mirrors the role that French colonies played for the French metropole as locales entirely dedicated to providing such pleasurable products as sugar or coffee, right? So the French Caribbean did not just produce sugar or coffee, as it turns out. Jacqueline's image tells us is that they also produced culture, right? And that culture also was exported to the metropole, at least circulated. So we may not know this, or we may have forgotten this, or those texts may have been, dismissed in a variety of ways throughout the years, but they did circulate and they were consumed and, as commodities of their own. And also importantly, they participated in building what we now understand as Frenchness. They necessarily also impacted cultural production locally. And here I quote another passage: "For better or for worse, the Black Caribbean imaginary, as we know it today, has been constructed in reaction to the vision that was fabricated in the fabrique in question." And so that's, another very, very important element of Jacqueline's book that I will get back to, and that Annie was mentioning earlier. Those, white planners, white Béquet authors of the 19th century, they had an influence on authors that also disagreed with them, right? These visions they created, if only to create, because people reacted against them, by extension are part of visions from people that we may find more palatable, right? In the 20th century or earlier. And this is one of, again, the maybe more uneasy genealogies that Jacqueline's book starts showing for all of us. Another element that's also central to this, to me, it is of special interest because it connects to some of the work I do. It also reveals another very deep and very crucial genealogy. It's an old Western tradition to conflate nations and women. And when it comes to waging war over the meaning of nationhood, women and their bodies have always been a central battlefield. Representations of the nation have tended to present it under the trope of the legitimate family with a virile father, the pure mother. In slaveholding societies, though, resting as they do on the systematization of sexual violence and the destruction of families, we're faced with a serious representational problem, let's say. And so, in the Ancien Régime, among the default representations of white planters was, including in metropolitan France and throughout Europe, they tended to be represented as perverts of sort, lecherous people, and the colonies themselves as a land of licentiousness, right? The entire Creole population also tended to be seen as racially dubious. It was well known in Europe that planters encouraged rape, that there was sexual violence, there was a lot of interracial mixing, and it was unnecessary, and it was not looked on as a positive thing, obviously. If nationalism requires racial purity, the colonies were of necessity the place where it came to be challenged. For this reason, colonies saw France's first and harshest segregationist and racist laws. So in the 1770s, notably in Saint-Domingue and Martinique, for example, you have harsher and harsher laws meaning to separate the races, in no small part precisely because the races were so close together, in violent and sometimes not so violent ways. Because racial categories were unstable, and that's another thing Jacqueline describes in her book, they had to be set in stone and constantly enforced in the law, as I mentioned, but also crucially, as Jacqueline demonstrates, in fiction and in culture. And so in the 19th century, Béquet writers committed to righting the wrongs of 18th century representation by flipping the script. And so in that first chapter where Jacqueline talks about the novel Les Amours de Zémédard et Carina by white Martinican Creole author Prévost de Sansac de Traversée, talk about it, that's the name. He presents libertinage as an import from revolutionary metropole, right? So entirely reverses the more traditional vision of the planter as the lecherous person. And here it is, a Frenchman from continental France that brings this sort of libertinage to the islands. And here, interracial relations are exclusively the domain of perverted metropolitans, right? In this way, Traversée erases the messy fact of Caribbean interracial relations to promote a self-serving vision of racial purity. Creoles in Traversée's novel, white or black, are known to keep to the bounds of their racial categories. Women, and I quote, must be the agents of their own virtue, and on their virtue rests the racial order of the colony. The Traversée makes clear that this order ultimately implicates France at large. His Creole family protects the island's racial order from metropolitan threats, but also offers it as a model applicable throughout France. And this, again, what Jacqueline describes here in culture, I find especially important because, again, it's a point of contention currently in France, but it seems fairly clear to me that it models a circulation of ideas that we see reproduced in France at the time and to our day at different levels, right? We see it's in law, it's in culture, but it's also in people's minds and the way people speak about national belonging and race, or do not speak about race for that matter. And so that fundamental reversal that's perpetuated in novels, historical texts throughout the 19th century, flies in the face of Caribbean reality then and now. But it contributes to create a sort of parallel reality for the Caribbean in particular, but also for France at large. In that parallel world, interracial relationships, rather than slavery, become, I quote, the crime that forever destroyed paradise for European colonists. But importantly, in its reiterations throughout the century, it also becomes a looming threat to the egalitarian promise of the Third Republic, right? The Bonneville novel that Annie mentioned earlier rejects racial discriminations, but it also sort of intertwines a peculiar defense of métissage as part of the new democratic model. It sort of takes it for granted in ways that sort of performs a different kind of erasure of race, right? If you assume that you can't see race, then there's no problem to begin with, right? I think we see the fruit of those seeds, let's say, in our current period. And so this to me is where Jacqueline's book shines the brightest, right? In illuminating the cultural background to that apparent paradox, the coexistence of a French Republican model rhetorically committed to anti-racism, yet profoundly racist in some of its institutions and practices. I've said it before, but this is one of 2021's most urgent conversations in France. And I think part of what's missing from that conversation, and it is very much a national conversation, is a general lack of education on the part of French people, but also a commitment to simplification, right? Among people who should know better, let's say. The ideal of sexual and racial purity is one such simplification. And Dangerous Creole Liaisons lays the groundwork for a difficult realization, which is that it's a simplification that connects, oftentimes unwittingly, white and Black, conservative and radical authors in the Caribbean tradition and beyond. And it is a simplification which, as is so often the case, is symbolically and literally built on the backs of Black women. Crucial insight on this matter resides in the book's title, right? So echoing the famous 18th century novel Dangerous Liaison by Coderlo de Laclos, Jacqueline highlights, and I quote, the commodified value of female bodies within a transaction in which women become the irresistible target of two fighting rivals. Rivals, it turns out, have more in common than they might be ready to recognize. And part of what they have in common is to sort of leave out Black women from the conversation and turn them into a battlefield again, as I mentioned earlier. So we may say more about this in discussion, and I also don't want to speak for too long, but I do want to post, how Jacqueline's work speaks to mine, and my book called The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture, which focuses on a very masculine trope, which also played over centuries, and I think played a role in the constitution of modern national sentiments in France, Great Britain, the United States, and throughout the Black Atlantic. I tend to focus more on Anglophone Caribbean and Saint-Domingue, but all those networks crisscross and speak to each other. And that to me is really yet another thing about Jacqueline's book that's really important. It suggests how nationalisms in the plural speak to each other in intrinsically gendered and raced discourse. Recurring element of current conversations in France bears on the alleged influence of American thinking on French scholars of color. But pointing out this influence in France is meant to dismiss all arguments, right? The idea is that American analyses of racism are irrelevant because, they don't match a French situation. But studies like Jacqueline demonstrate not only the emptiness of such statements, but also how they actively obfuscate the truth. Frenchness, it turns out, is a global affair, and certainly a notion that was in no small part developed, if not in the US, at least in the Americas, in and in functions of the Americas. And as she shows in the chapter where she discusses Lefkadjo Hearn's writing on Martinique, for example, US Americans have long played a part in the construction of French outlooks on the French Caribbean, and by extension on France itself. By the same token, French Caribbean writers have just as long influenced American understandings of race, nationhood, and Americanness. The novels Jacqueline studies in the book predate and announced US tragic mulatto stories, for example, from Victor Séjour to William Faulkner, and related reflections on race, purity, incest, and violence. The greatest trick the nation ever pulled was convincing the world that there is such a thing as purity. And I think, again, that is one thing we can glean from Jacqueline's book. So I want to conclude here with a quote from Jacqueline's website. And I quote, so in creation, chaos is inevitable, particularly when one deals with the Caribbean. My chaos reflects a particular and baffling order, something that seems to be looking for itself, but really has its own logic, ready to manifest itself unpredictably. I am not interested in maintaining the status quo. I do not consider chaos as a foe, but an instability pregnant with different perspectives. So I've read a chapter from Jacqueline's upcoming book, Sex, Sea and Self, Sexuality and Nationalism in French Caribbean Discourse. discourses, right, which continues the work of Dangerous Creole Liaison at a later period and shows how patterns developed in the 19th century were perpetuated in the 20th century, notably in the writings of Black Caribbean writers. I hope we'll get to hear her say a little more about this project today. Needless to say, this promises to make a few people uneasy. I, for one, am looking forward to reading more of Jacqueline's chaos. And that's what I get.
Thank you so much. Yes, we know some people are not going to like it, but that's the joy, I think, of our, discussion today. So now I will ask Greg and Annie just to ask me one question. There's also one question in the Q&A, and I think it's a question that all of us can also answer to. Kimberly Jones is a graduate student at Rice, and she's looking into race in colonial America. And I think a question is really great. So I want to make sure we save time to answer a question. That's the only question so far. And then you could, so what do you think? That you ask me a question, or we just go and talk about Kimberly's question?
Muted. Why don't we go with Kimberly's question? Let's give her.
Great, and after that we start the. Yeah. So can the panel say more about how rumor and false representations of Blackness from the 19th century continue to create precarity for Black people in the French context? And I think this question is so, yes, I mean, this question is going back, Greg, to what you were talking about, the discussion of race you have in France. I will just have a quick answer, and I'm going to let you to answer to that. In the course, I teach my students Black Venus, and then this refers also to the latest book of Robin Mitchell. I'm showing my students, starting with white Creole, planters, how, for instance, in Moreau de Saint-Méry, in the first chapter, it talks about how Black women give birth, enslaved Black women give birth, boom, no problems, and then like she can go back and work in the field. My students are always horrified to read that. And then we have discussions about how in the medical field, whether in the US, but also in France, you always have this idea that Black women or Black people, they don't feel pain. And my students are always surprised to see how this is an old trope that they think is a truth. So this is the way I could answer to Kimberly's question. If you look into the work of Moreau de Saint-Méry, you will see some archetypes, some representations of Black people, but also Black women that you see nowadays. And they're not considered as rumor or false because Moreau de Saint-Méry presented his work as a scientific one. So I'm always wary of sciences in the 18th and then 19th century. So that was my reply to Kimberly. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I was just teaching Charles Chestnut in class yesterday, and we were reading The Passing of Grandison. And again, quickly for people who might not know the story, an essential part of it is that the central Black character is one of the characters we never hear think, right? So everybody has ideas about the kind of person that he is and what he believes in until, the big reveal at the end, which I will not reveal in case you haven't read it because it's really worth it. That demonstrates that the entire time, not only did we not know what he thought, but nobody bothered to wonder, right? And I feel that, the question and what you were just saying is we see that there's an international network of this, right? I mean, the French do it maybe a slightly different way, but what you were pointing to me is essential, right? It's the idea that you can use your personal bias and pretend it's a science, right? And I don't know. I mean, we may find many occurrences of this, but it was turned into its own science, right? Turning bias into science about people of African descent, and I think it's a regime that, again, perpetuates itself in, we can trace those genealogies as you did, right? There's the pseudoscience that remains within the sciences to this day, but also, throughout again, throughout culture at large, right? I mean, it's scary enough when doctors believe this, but we see, I mean, that I think that constant, and maybe other examples that we see perpetuated in movies and literature to this day.
Thank you. Annie, do you want to add something?
Well, I think that I would probably kind of piggyback on what you said. I agree with what you said, but I think that what is very interesting, and I want to kind of l- locate the debate at the level of the students and the ways in which they react. And I'm glad that Kimberly asked this question. The ways in which they try to understand how 19th century discourses can still be prevalent. And yesterday, I was in my course Introduction to Francophone Studies. We were kind of wrapping up on our analysis of Tintin Congo. And to me, it was essential to really, in addition to explain to the students the ways in which Petit Nègre is constructed, is laid out in the bande dessinée. And what it means. Of course, we studied Le Noir et le Langage by Fanon, but I think that it was also essential for them to go back to much earlier, I mean, before Fanon, and go back to Hegel, La raison dans l'histoire, where Hegel clearly says that Africa is out of history. There is no history in Africa. And then there is these long chapters and long lines where he explains carefully to the reader that he's not going to get into any kind of argument, any kind of analysis about Africa, because it's just this kind of non-place. And I'm kind of bringing this to the conversation because it was really fascinating to see students' reaction and understand that there is a way to kind of locate the origins of the discourse. And if we do not go back to those original texts, so if we don't do what you do, Jacqueline, in Dangerous Liaisons, how can we clearly provide students with the critical tools that they will need in order to recalibrate, in order to position themselves to whatever they would be listening to on the radio, in the media, on social media, or at the dinner table. So I think that it's really, your book is really important. It's important because it, as you said, Greg, it allows us to go back to this idea of genealogy, how we disrupt this genealogy, but how at the same time we interrogate it because the genealogy is so harmful. Yet, okay, we live with it. Okay, so yeah, so I think that's what I wanted to kind of bring to the conversation.
Thank you. That's I really agree with that. Making connections allow us to see that whatever we thought was the truth or whatever representations we see nowadays have been old one, and they're dangerous. And we need to realize why they're dangerous so that we could change the discussion. And to change the discussions, sometimes that's why I wrote this book. I was tired of reading, and there's no literature before Césaire. I was like, yeah, no, that's not true. And, Black people never thought about themselves a particular way, or white Creoles. And I'm like, no, that's not true. That's why, I took great pleasure to do a special edition of Les Amours de Zémédar et Karina. Because when you read that particular novel, you realize that a lot of things we believe or thought about Béké or white Creoles were just wrong. And their relationship with France, it's, as we say in the US, it's complicated. And that's why, that's this idea of, it's complicated that I'm interested into. I wanted, people to be attracted to that, or at least to bring them to a world that doesn't make sense. Because this book is not about trying to make sense of everything, but just showing, you may have heard about what is the Caribbean, you may have heard about what is literature, but this book is telling you that you need to open your mind to something else. And again, who decides what is good or bad literature. Even that is a work of biases. I mean, I hate Paul and Virginia, Paul et Virginie by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre with a passion. And yet is a fabulous book in the French canon. So who would say that this French Creole writer, this is bad literature when compared to Bernardin de Saint-Pierre? So that's why, as Annie said at the beginning, and I thank you for that, I'm not into discussion good or bad literature. I'm just what these texts are saying, and they were read by people. Because those white Creoles went to France, went back to the Caribbean, and they were also friends with great French writers. So we may not have time to a lot of questions because it's already 2:32, but quickly, maybe one question from Greg and one question from Annie, and then we will keep on continuing enjoying our lives.
Okay, I have a quick question for you. How did you come across these texts for the first time? And I'm sort of always interested in the genesis of projects that, I mean, generally speaking, but yours in particular. Now, as you say, like those were texts that were read at the time, but they sort of fell by the wayside. So how did you come across them? So
James Arnold used to be my research director. So when I did my PhD and I took courses, the whole idea started when I took a Cuban course and I discovered a lot of Cuban novels from 19th century. And I was like, if they're doing that in Cuba, why about Martinique? And then, of course, we started with Raphael Confiant, we started with Chamoiseau, and in their work, they do talk about white Creole authors, but they just say, yeah, they wrote, but it's crap, basically. And then I was interested, and Martinican scholars, or in fact, there were fonctionnaires like Auguste Joyaux, have been collecting those novels and look at them. So I've got like the 3 tomes of 19th century novels that Joyaux's daughter gave to me when she heard of the work. So first, I also read Corzani, and he was just making a list of those novels. So when I wrote my dissertation, I was all about the Creolist. But I was like, yeah, I cannot really talk to them because I cannot really talk about their work without knowing what was happening before, because they look at the past and they make a lot of connections. And I'm like, yeah, but is it really the past, or is it the reconstruction of the past, or is it their reconstruction of the past? And that could be problematic. So when I read a lot of overviews of literature by Corzani, you have Corzani, you have Régis Antoine, like, yeah, white Creole wrote that, nah, not good. You do have some people of African descent writing things in the 1920s, not good. Ooh, Césaire, yay. So I decided to read that for myself. And those novels they're good, they're fine. I hate them, I hate the content of it, but I hate also, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, Paul et Virginie. So basically, I started with 20th century and I went back and I read, theoretical work. And that's why I'm very thankful to Annie saying that we need to disrupt some of the work some earlier scholars have done. They've done a great job, but they made everything too rigid. You may read, a study saying, oh, do not look at those people, they're just useless. And then you keep on going. But then when you read their work, you realize, oh no, they're not useless, there are things to say. They say a lot about Martinique. And I was also happy to discover Martinique through Traverse's eyes. It's beautiful, not for Black people, but I could feel his love for the island. So I think that was important and interesting. Oh wow! Now you have 2 more questions. Woo! So that's my answer. That's my answer, Greg. Annie, do you want?
I have so many questions, but that's going to be for after the Zoom. But let me go with this one, which is some sort of a follow-up to Greg's point. If you were to, because I talk a lot, and Jacqueline, and you know how both of us, we keep discussing about this disruption of the canon. If you were to label, to name this literature, would you keep on saying Beke literature? Or would you, I mean, I'm just trying to think in terms of, if we disrupt the canon, why would we label them? Why can't we just include them in the canon? Because they teach us so much about this period and about the ways in which we need to repurpose, rethink our current, our contemporary entanglement. So I guess that the question, to make it short, is it necessary to use the word white Creoles to name this literature? Why would this adjective be useful?
Because unfortunately, we live in a world where categories are it, which is unfortunate. And then when you navigate between two spaces, France and the US, if in a text I said someone from the metropole, most of the time I mean white person. So when you write in French, you don't always need to say white for someone to know if this person is white. But then if you write in English, then you suddenly, and it's a difficult question because sometimes, and I know that Marlene Doubt's books, Tropics of Haiti, in the introduction, she's like, I'm not going to talk about race, I'm not going to do this, but you cannot do without it. This is the problem. That's why at one point I used Beke, and then I stopped. I'm like, I'm just going to use white Creoles, because Beke at times could be, depending on the spelling, could be pejoratives, and we all Creole. So I put white because by white, I indicate not merely a color, but a cultural background, information about the elite. And as we know with Bonneville, not all white Creoles have the same version. So sometimes I was saying the contrary thing, it's just, I was like, okay, white Creole, this is not a monolith, but we're all going to call them white Creole, but this one, Bonneville, is doing something different. But it's the same discussion with Black. Everyone is Black, or do we talk about Afro-descendants? And I think we're at the beginning of the discussion. And when we revisit this idea of Caribbean literature, we may decide we don't need all these code words from culture, from race. Unfortunately, I think it's difficult to do without it, to do without this notion of race, or talk about particular groups. So, in ideal world, I would like to do without, but at least until we reach maybe literature of 21st century, we need those elements to really bring to the fore the complexity of what we're talking about. And that's why, thanks, Greg, for reading my introduction about chaos, because my mind is always all over the time, all over the space, all over the place. But this is it. We cannot talk about French Caribbean literature, about French Caribbean culture in one way. Like, we're coming from islands where you have earthquakes, where you have volcano exploding, then we have the plantation world, you have violence. All of that have created many layers of understanding of what we think it means to be Martinican, Guadeloupeans, Black, Creole. So that's why each time I take some time to explain what I mean by a term. So that's why I wanted cross-pollination and not creolization. Creolization is fine, but I really wanted people to know what I was doing with that term, because creolization, so many people are using that sometimes you don't even know, what it means in a particular context. So we have 3 questions. What I will do, and I know you can read them, what I will do, I think it would just be nice to have a look at them and just answer them. So the first one is from Rose and Dengue, and she's wondering if my work is taught in sociology, political sciences, or history courses. Ooh, I would love to know that. That's a good one. The second one is from Solvay, who is also a graduate student of Rice. At the moment, she's in Iceland, which is nice. And she would like us, and she's interested into race in 19th century. And she would like us, to talk about the literatures written by white Creole authors circulate in the United States in the 19th century. How did US readership perpetrate the fantasy that these writers were producing? I think that would be very easy with Lafcadio Heard. And then Elle Mackenzie, that I don't know, but I'm happy she joined us today. What do you think of the current debate in France concerning the teaching of race and post-colonial theory? And I think, Greg, you mentioned that a little bit. So I think what we could do, just like 5 minutes quickly, answer those questions, and then we thank everyone, and people could contact you. Greg is very active via Twitter. Annie Curtius is coming back on April the 16th to talk about a book. So you have to come back, and then you could ask her more questions. So as far as what Rose wanted to know, I know one person in the UK using my book on a course on nationalism. I was like, all right, that's nice. But that's it. Because I Googled my name and I found the syllabus. I was like, oh, that's different. So yes, it could be. But again, if people don't know the book, they won't be able to know what the book is doing. So that's why I thought today will be a great opportunity to talk about the importance of literature and of what we are doing. So we have the second question about white Creole 19th century. Who wants to take that one? Go for it, Greg.
So it might be a little bit of a tangent, but I was recently working on a pretty big project with Marlene Doubt and Marion Rohrleitner. It's an anthology of fictions of the Haitian Revolution. And one of the things that this book will show really well is just how much those texts circulated. It's actually, it was surprising to me, and I expected it will be surprising to a lot of readers. Some of those stories, novels, are translated from French to English. We're talking about planters that used to be in Saint-Domingue, so many of them at that point are living in continental France or elsewhere in the Caribbean. But their texts are translated and circulated to the US, to Great Britain, to throughout Europe. But we also see many authors from the US either adapting or stories that they read in the newspaper, stories that they read from French authors, from planters. So those ideas circulate a lot, and they most definitely in the US, which again has its own population of people descended from French planters from the Caribbean, right? They escaped Saint-Domingue, but also Martinique and Guadeloupe during the Revolutionary era. So again, we might think that the language barrier would be an obstacle, but from all evidence, it wasn't as much of an obstacle as we might think. Like, those texts were very well known throughout the Atlantic world.
And if you read Moreau de Saint-Méry, then you realize that Moreau de Saint-Méry went to the US right after the Revolution, where some of these texts were published. So the connections, literally looking at 19th century and mobility, which is kind of interesting because at the time they only had boats, but they move a lot. And so I think that's why you just have to do some work and look for those archives. And the interesting things is now a lot of things is digitized. So you don't even have to travel. You just have to look, there's some bank of information in Martinique, Guadeloupe. You also have some of them with the BNF. So there's many things you could find. And I really believe, and it's an argument in the first book and the second one, like newspapers, as you said, Greg, if you know, people read newspapers because you have novels and stories. And if they didn't know how to read, someone will read the stories to them. So, and it was expensive to publish in book form. So that's why newspapers are very important and a nice source to look at. Annie, do you have anything to say about this, or do you want to do the?
No, I can do the next question because I feel like you guys kind of covered
Yes.
pretty well.
So yeah, let's finish the last one because that one is a big one.
Ooh la la, this one is a big one.
Yeah, I'm tired already.
I think that all I can say, Ali, I think it's Ali. I think that back in the, I would say probably end of the 90s, early 21st century, there was already a very virulent debate in France about the necessity to teach post-colonial theory. It was seen as a threat. And most of the conversation going on around this notion of threat was kind of focusing on a threat coming from the US. Oh, people coming from the US kind of disseminate this notion of post-colonial theory, which in a sense, I would say for some scholars who were not really happy with post-colonial theory, was not necessary. So that kind of came out as some sort of a non-necessary thing. And again, something coming from the US that scholars in France are trying to imitate. And I think that as we're speaking right now, in March 2021, with this new debate, new movement, and cancel culture, I think that in France, again, scholars are seeing post-colonial theory as an extra threat because of cancel culture coming again from the US. So I think that there is always this kind of tension between those two spaces, US, France, one producing a post-colonial theory and another one shy about this post-colonial theory for a number of reasons. So to kind of wrap up, because it's actually it's worth another Zoom. It's such a big question. I think that we have in one continent, slavery existed on the US continent. So we have a presence of slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights movement on the continent. In France, we have slavery as from what people think, as something that was outside mainland France, that was not directly connected to the geography of mainland France. So in a way, I think that scholars kind of think about slavery and the issue of race as something that should not belong to a conversation that is strictly happening within the borders of mainland France. So I think that there is a tension between what geography and history provide as far as race is concerned. I could say more, but it's so complex. But to kind of wrap up, I think that there is a real problem in France to not consider post-colonial theory as a viable field of study, because there is a fear. It's a threat of the sense that there is a fear that this theory, those critical paradigms, will disrupt something in the national, in the sum of a national narrative. Okay, the narrative should not be disrupted, and all of a sudden, post-colonial theory comes all the way around to repurpose this national narrative. So this is coming really. This is big, and France is caught, is entangled with in this tension. So I think that's what I can say, but this is not enough. I could say more, but I kind of wrapped up.
Thank you, Annie. Greg, I will give you 1 second just to summarize a point if you want to. Ali, Greg talked about this at the beginning. So if you look at the video, you will hopefully hear more about that. But, there's a lot of discussions on Twitter. My point is like, if you think about Aimé Césaire, about Fanon, you're thinking that a lot of this post-colonial theory is French anyway. If you think about Foucault, Derrida, like if you wouldn't have gender theory without Simone de Beauvoir. So as Annie says, there's really, and I think Greg, you said this at the beginning, there's a lack of knowledge about French history. Or maybe they pretend they don't know. But, like Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, they all started questioning this big kind of national narrative of France, and they gave ideas to the US. So it's really a dialogue. That's why I think looking at 19th century literature is interesting to see that French theory or ideas, idées des Lumières or whatever, everything was turning. And at one point you forgot where's the origin. So anyway, as we say in France, it's un faux débat. It's not a real, they're just talking about something else. They're talking about that, not to talk about something else. But again, we could have a Zoom maybe on that point. Greg, do you want to say something, or you're like, not touching that?
Just quickly, because I think that's maybe a nice way to wrap up and get back to your book. I think, part of what it shows also is that those same conversations were happening 200 years ago. And, not the same, obviously, but then essentially the same. And maybe they did, in some ways, they ignored them less then than they do now, which is maybe ironic, because of course, we claim to carry the values inherited from that time of turmoil. But, they had to face this in ways that, current authorities, let's say in France right now, think they don't have to. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to think that it's hostile also, that it might be angry, yeah, certainly, but if they, in essence, they say over and over and over again that they can ignore the Caribbean, that they can ignore French people who come, whose history includes ancestors being made to suffer by France. But we're still French, right? I mean, it's not like we have a choice to go somewhere else. I don't see how anybody would consider it a problem to reckon with French history. But then we see, similar movements of ignorance in the US and Great Britain right now. There's no good end to this. And what I wish people would get out of this is that it is everybody's history. And everybody gains at knowing it and at talking about it. Maybe that's naive, but that's what I think. And I think books like yours encourage this kind of conversation. That's my point.
Thank you so much. So Zora said, thank you for the Salon. And we've decided to organize a lot of events. I posted in the chat a list of events organized by the School of Humanities, organized by the Center of African and African American Studies, and also by Women's Studies. So you could click on it and just see, we're just trying to start a discussion here. And I think this is it. My book is, Reviewer 2 hated it, nothing new there, because, why are you talking about that? So for 200 years, people have been talking about the same thing. So it's literally the Amlish. It's like, the repressed, you repress something and it's coming back. It's coming back. That's why I like the idea of Gothic. And that's why there's so many things we could say. And that's why we do whatever we do until someone decides to listen to us, hopefully. So Greg and Annie, thank you so much for your input, for all your discussions. That was fabulous. Thank you for the people who stayed with us till the end. We appreciate you and your patience. And do not hesitate to contact any of us if you have, more questions. You could find me on Cultures website.